Hello and welcome back to 9-Inch Charge. Today, Games Workshop have released another article detailing rules coming out for Warhammer, the Old World, this time focusing on movement, and they've previewed another article for shooting which should be coming out next week. So it's good that these are coming thick and fast now. They should be out every week, talking about the different phases of the game. Movement, really interesting, some really big changes. A couple things to say kind of straight off the bat before we dive into it is firstly, people who thought this game wasn't going to be like Warhammer Fantasy Battles, do not worry. It is very much like Warhammer Fantasy Battles, it seems, from the movement phase. And secondly, anybody who was worried that the game was going to be dumbed down or oversimplified, put those thoughts and feelings to one side because it's quite involved. Tom and I have been trying to wrap our heads around some of the new things that are coming up, and we think we've cracked it. So we're looking forward to sharing with you our thoughts and feelings from the article as we go through it. But just before we begin, as always, if you are coming back to enjoy our content again and again, please be sure to drop it a like. It really means a lot to us. It costs nothing and just really helps the channel out. And if you are a repeat viewer but you're not yet subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel. There'll be a button somewhere around that you can click on. And again, costs nothing but really helps the channel out. And you'll never miss a beat when it comes to our videos on the Old World. All right, so let's kick off with formations. So it talks about 4 different kinds of formations. First one being close order. And close order is your normal rank and flank unit. They all kind of move as one. They all have to be in base-to-base contact. This is what we're used to in the rank and flank games. It does talk about open order as well. And these are a formation that are a little bit swifter. They might be a bit better at moving over terrain and things like that. But they are still an ordered formation of soldiers, essentially. Next is skirmish, which is a very loose formation, which we'll all be familiar with. Tom, you'll be familiar with playing against an army of skirmishers, won't you? When you played against my wood elves.
Yeah, nightmare.
So they just have to be within an inch of each other. They don't necessarily have a forward-facing arc. They seem to be very much the same. And the last formation it talked about was the lance formation, which is only for Bretonia, but of course Bretonia being a big part of the new setting and one of the starter armies, they wanted to demonstrate what that looks like as well. It used to be that you would have your wedge formation as it is here, and you'd get attacks from every model kind of up the side of the wedge and then one at the front. And then however deep it was, that was your ranks. You didn't have to have all the same number of models per rank to get a rank bonus. But as familiar as these formations are, you can order them quite differently now. And I think the thing that we really want to talk about before we talk about the sub-phases of the movement phase is having your close and open order units in one of 2 ways. You can have them in combat order or a marching column. Now, Tom, you seem to understand this much better than I do. So why don't you explain this to us, myself included?
Okay. So I'm just going to read the article and then I suppose we'll open it up for some discussion. So, combat order. This unit is wider than it is deeper, i.e., it has more models per rank than it has per file. Therefore, this unit is said to be in combat order. So that's going to be in the article. You can see it's a 5x3 block of orcs in a really standard formation. We've seen it all through fantasy, all through the Old World and Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Now, the new one and the really interesting one for me is marching column. This unit is deeper than it is wide, i.e., it has more models per file than it has per rank. Therefore, this unit is said to be in marching column. Okay. So the bonus of a marching column is if you're marching in your marching column, you move 3 times your distance. So if we use the example of the skeleton horde that's used later in the article, a movement of 4 marched in a marching column is a 12-inch movement. That's quite intense. If you remember back in old editions, that would have been 2 less movement than your cavalry, right? If they were movement 7, that's a lot of movement from a unit of foot sloggers. It does have disadvantages, so you cannot charge in marching column, and if you get attacked or charged, you don't claim any rank bonus. So that's what they are, and there's a few more things in the article that interact with that and make it a bit interesting. I think some stuff I've tried to wrap my head around.
What's interesting about that for me is that I think we were talking about the old bus units, so you might take something with a narrower frontage and make it very deep to get your make sure you're maximizing your combat resolution so that you're always steadfast and you're not going anywhere. Whereas actually if you do that now, it's unusual to think that you would have more ranks but get no rank bonus in combat. You actually have to have less ranks to get your rank bonus, which is quite counterintuitive. The other thing that I wanted to say about this was I was looking at the marching column because the unit has reformed there to be a marching column, and it's gone from a frontage of 5 to a frontage of 4. And then I was like, you can't have a frontage of 4. You haven't been able to have a frontage of 4 since I started playing at the end of 5th edition way back when. And then I read the other article. You reminded me, Tom, the old development diary that we had way back when. Let me have a look when it came out in July. And it says here, if I can just find it, that the ideal number of models per rank is decided by the player, not enforced by the rules. So this gives you so much flexibility now in how you decide to order your units. You can have, I mean, I think back then we were talking about the conga line because everything in the fighting rank fights, doesn't it? So if you had a unit with just a frontage, you could have a unit of 20 up the front, or you could have a unit with 2 up the front. It's kind of up to you how you decide to put your models, and it gives you a lot of flexibility now, and it's interesting. I wonder how things will work and where the meta will go with it, because I always used to take my elves. I used to take a frontage of 7 because I'd assume that my opponent would have a frontage of 5, and then I could maximize attacks by having 1 either side. But that isn't the case now. You just need to clip someone and everything fights. Really interesting. So I don't know where it will go. I don't know what will be the new optimum front, but it would be kind of nice if there wasn't, and there are some people who are kind of doing something different and interesting with how they choose to deploy their units and how many ranks and things they have. But I, for one, am interested in this new marching column because it opens up a lot. Like you said, all of a sudden your skeletons are movement 12, my elves will be movement 15, but they're very fragile, so it is a high risk, high reward, I suppose.
But for me, all of this and what we've read in the last article adds tactics and decisions. And I think having to make a decision in a war game is very cool, and I love it. So one big thing I'm reading when I read these formations, the columns and the order, it's kind of almost like a soft lock to your unit. So if we remember the Skaven slave bus or the Dwarven warrior bus back in the day, where you'd have 30 unit models in a unit, or even more if it was the slaves, and it was 5 wide. They all had great weapons, and you'd be sat there all day fighting one unit of dwarves. And I'm really glad this seems to have eliminated that issue without changing a massive amount. I think that's a really clever, ingenious way of solving an issue that shouldn't really exist.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I was thinking of, just as we were speaking then, was if you remember the old Swordmaster bus, like a unit of 5 Swordmasters in the conga line, and they just charge straight and decapitate the character. I'm glad
it's a frontage of 3, wasn't it? And supported attacks by 2 at the back. Yeah.
So that's really cool. I think for meta wise, if it was me, I'd have a big, strong block of if I was to use dwarves, warriors with strong ranks, and then on the side I'd have maybe units of hammerers, maybe 3 in a front, a unit of ranks of 2 or ranks of 3, so they can get their counter charge off and stick in your side where you're not going to want them. So that's what I would be looking at if I was pre-meta gaming, strong blocks, and then how to support that block on the flanks with other units.
Yeah, it opens up a lot. I mean,
yeah,
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's cool if we don't know what the scenarios are, but if a scenario calls for you to quickly be on the other side of the table, then it's going to be really necessary, isn't it? To use that. It kind of feels a bit like you're going to want to use your marching columns to get your units where you want them to be, and then you will fan out into your combat order, and that's where you'll have your ranks, and then you'll keep where you're stood if you're on an objective, a hill, or whatever it might be where you want to be. It would be interesting to see how it pans out in the game, and cool to have some options there. So there's a lot more to be said on how that's going to interact in the game, but I think we need to be playing some games and seeing the scenarios before we can comment too much further.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So then the article goes on to talk about the movement phase. And as we saw in the strategy phase, each phase is divided into 4 sub-phases. So the first part of the movement phase is declaring your charges. So this will be all of your units that are able to charge. So as we said, not the units in the marching column. So it says the active player nominates each unit that they want to charge. And then it says charging is the only way to enter combat, which is interesting because there used to be other ways to enter combat. I can remember there used to be an old Wood Elf spell where you could move 2d6 forward, and if you've got into contact with something, you count as being combat. Weren't there things with random movement that would just kind of like didn't the Mangler Squigs just roll dice and see where they ended up, and they could be in combat?
Well, no, you could never be in combat with them. They just rolled through everything.
Oh, right, fine.
I think the Snotling Pump Wagon was one with random movement. There were some interesting caveats to it before that had random elements of movement that got you in combat.
So that would be a change to the game that's quite big if charging is the only way to enter combat, because there were some other kind of sneaky ways before. But there might be some still, and it would just be captured in the wording of the spell or something like that. But we'll have to wait and see. I think what it's trying to say is that in the movement phase, you can't just stroll into combat. You must declare a charge.
Yeah.
And to declare a charge, the target unit must be visible to you and at least partially in your front arc. Your unit cannot be fleeing or have rallied this turn or be already engaged in combat. And
so that answers a question from our last video, right? Can you rally and then charge?
No, you can't.
That's a bit
The biggest change for me, and one of the most interesting ones, is how charges work now, because they work slightly different. When I started playing Warhammer, a charge was double your move, but you couldn't measure. And then it became your movement plus 2d6, and we had but you could measure. And now it's a slight in between, isn't it? So you can measure the distance, and if you're a unit of infantry, you you roll 2d6 and take the highest dice and add it to your movement. So your charge range, the example it gives is a unit of skeletons, which are movement 4. So their charge range will be between 5 and 10 inches. The other difference is that if you have to wheel to get into combat, that isn't free anymore. That's included in the charge distance, which was a big thing Tom and I were talking about before.
Yeah.
Because it used to be
Closest to closest.
Closest, yeah. But now that wheel is taken into consideration. So if you have to then wheel 2 inches, your charge is 2 inches longer. What's interesting about that for me is that charge distances are quite short now compared to what we were used to in 8th edition.
Yeah, massively. There's no like booking it 16 inches across the table anymore.
No. You know, the most you're going to go is an extra 6 on top of your movement. If a man is movement 5, you know, that's going to tell you kind of how long your charges are. 11 will kind of be the biggest charge that you could make. That did make me, and especially if you're going to have a wheel in there, if you're not quite faced up, that did make me think that fleeing is something that's more of a viable option now, because if you flee 6 inches or a d6, you might not actually have to roll very high to get out of that distance.
No, absolutely not. And then you can just rally again in your turn like it's nothing.
But if you are caught, you are dead outright.
Yeah.
So it does have that risk with it, but I do think it's probably more of an option than it was before.
I think that leads to a great opportunity to screen with skirmishers again, because you could set up just the right amount of distance behind your skirmishers to flee, hopefully pass your leadership check, and you may not have the distance to redirect into your big block, and then in your subsequent turn countercharge in with everything and annihilate a unit you've just pulled out of position.
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads of cool stuff. I mean, I can't wait to play the game now. Talking about situations like this is really cool. So it just makes me really want to play it now. So once you've declared charges, the inactive player declares charge reactions. So most units may hold to receive a charge, stand and shoot if they have missile weapons and are further away than the charging unit's movement characteristic, or flee by pivoting 180 degrees and trying to escape. If you're caught, however, you'll be run down and destroyed. And beyond that, some especially alert units can countercharge. So I don't know what the countercharge looks like. It's a whole new charge reaction for me. I suppose that it would negate some of the benefits of your opponent charging you. So when I first started playing fantasy, if you charged, you always had the initiative. You'd always strike first. Or in later editions that I played, charging would give you an extra bonus to your combat resolution. So I feel like it might negate one of those, but I don't know which. Can't say at the moment.
So if you remember, Empire used to have a detachment rule, and countercharge was a charge reaction the detachment could do if the parent unit was charged, if it was within a certain range of its parent unit. So maybe you might see stuff like that come back.
Which would be very cool. About that cool detachment that they could do, actually, yeah. And then if you roll the distance that you need, you go into combat, and if you don't, then the charge has failed. But then the unit moves the full distance it's rolled towards its target, minus the amount that it would have had to wheel if it had to wheel at the end, which is really cool, because it used to be that if you failed a charge, you'd move like 3 inches, and I never understood that, especially when the charge distance was long. that you would kind of charge headlong, and then you go, oh, we're not quite going to make it, and then you kind of turn around and try and reform, and it didn't seem right. And sometimes what was frustrating about that was, well, I know, for example, because I used to play more of a defensive army, someone would try and charge me, like long bomb me, say, and then they'd fail it and they'd move 3 inches. Whereas an elf, I could move 2.5 inches back in my movement phase, and they're like right back where they started. They're half an inch closer to making that charge, but not anything significant. So I think that does help. You know, it helps get combats together, and it helps anything that helps make moving a bit easier, and I think it does.
Yeah.
It's cool. And like you said, Tom, it gives more. It's a bit more risk reward because you're closer for that next turn, and sometimes it doesn't matter if you charge or get charged. You just want to be in combat, and then other times, like you said, you can now pull a unit out out of formation from what you want. So yeah, I think I like that change a lot.
Yeah. So like, if there were detachment rules in, you could pull a parent unit out of position. And if it's not made his charge, it's sitting right in the open for you. Because charge distances are really small now. And chances are you're going to make that counter charge in the next turn. And you could get it in flanks. You could hit it with some heavy cavalry. You could, if like failing a charge, I feel is going to be catastrophic in this edition. It's not going to be something you want to happen.
Yeah, especially when we get onto the later mechanics of normal moving and being how free you are to pivot around. If there's a unit with a flank exposed somewhere over there, you're going to be able to turn around quite quickly. But we'll get on to that. The third step is compulsory moves, and this is to accommodate fleeing units that have failed to rally during the last strategy phase, but includes other rarer moves such as random movement of Night Goblin Fanatics, or you move units that have failed their stupidity test in the strategy phase. Okay, so the fourth step covers remaining moves, regular maneuvers that don't result in combat. So this is kind of your normal moves. So, and there are lots of different new mechanics for moving that are quite interesting. Some have stayed the same and some are new. So I'll just read from the article to start. As you'd expect from a game of multi-model units acting in concert, movement in Warhammer the Old World is fairly involved. In general, units may move or march, performing maneuvers on the way. In the first case, they move up to their movement characteristic and may then shoot later in the turn. In the latter case, they may double their pace, but they sacrifice the ability to perform any maneuver more complex than a wheel and their ability to shoot this turn for speed. So if you march, you can only wheel and you can't shoot, and otherwise you can remaneuver and reconfigure the unit and still shoot, as long as you only use your movement characteristic. And then within that, it talks about what you can do and how much maneuvers cost. So while moving, a unit may wheel, in which the unit pivots from one of the front corners of its leading edge, measuring the distance from the outside model. We all remember this, how, when you turn your units, it just costs your normal movement, however many inches you're turning the unit around that point. You may also turn all the unit's models through 90 degrees or 180 degrees, spending a quarter of your movement for each 90 degrees. Move backwards or sideways at half price, or half pace, and redress the ranks or reform. It doesn't say how much of your movement it costs to redress the ranks or reform. It may well cost all your movement, kind of from the reading. It's like, this costs a quarter, this costs half, and you may well do this, which is interesting because it means that if you want to get somewhere quite quickly, actually getting into that marching column costs you a whole turn of movement. So it probably is more beneficial to start in or be deployed in that that way to get its benefit, rather than trying to change into it. So it's better probably to march up in your marching column, then reform or redress the ranks so that you're in a combat order.
a lot of new terminology to learn, right? I really like it. I think it's another example of you've got to think 2, maybe 3 turns ahead whilst being flexible enough to adapt to what's actually going on, which I think is going to make the game very tactical.
Yeah, yeah. I also like the flexibility you get in movement now, with being able to turn like 90 degrees for a quarter of your movement. There's a little bit of controversy about the wording of this. I don't think it should be too controversial, but it says you may turn all of a unit's models through 90 degrees, and some people are thinking you're turning them on their head, and other people are thinking you're turning the unit.
Yeah.
Tom and I have gone back and forth a bit. I've decided that you turn the unit.
I've decided you turn them on his head.
Game of turning models around. But yeah, I mean, lots of flexibility for how you move things around. I like that you can swivel, and I think that gives quite a lot of opens up a lot of options, especially for shooting units. And another thing Tom and I have said before, that we felt like it's been quite tricky to be caught out of line of sight. Like, you can have a unit just to your right and you can't see them, and then you'd have to like reform, and turning around so you could see them would be quite tricky. And now you can just turn, and then your front arc is quite wide. Although you still wouldn't be able to charge them that turn. That's fine, but it does help, I think.
Yeah, I think it's good for shooters as well, because having skirmishers dance around you and you're constantly trying to swift reform to catch them, to shoot them, was an absolute nightmare.
And it's also beneficial for spell casting, if you need line of sight to cast a spell in a subsequent phase. If you need to cast that magic missile or something like that,
Yeah,
you can turn through 90 degrees to be able to see that unit that you want to cast your magic missile at, if you need line of sight to cast it.
my question to you is, Dan, how many movement trays are you going to bring for each model, each unit you deploy?
Oh, I know. I mean, I tell you what is annoying about this, actually, is those of you who have seen, as I was hobbying along with my Wood Elf project, I have taken my Wood Elf army that was on its 20 mil bases, and I've bought slotter trays that you can put them in, and then it creates a frontage of what you would want for 25 mils. But now I'm going to be taking them out of that and reforming them, probably at least once a game, if I've started them off in the marching column, to then get them in the combat order. So yeah, I think that does represent a challenge, and I think it does mean that people who didn't think they were going to have to rebase their models may well have to.
Yeah,
I'll put the link in the description. There's something else I found from Green Stuff World. I got them, and they are base adapters. You just slot your model into a base, and it becomes 25 mils. And I think that would be much easier to use in conjunction with movement trays and you won't have to rebase everything, and they slot in really well. So I'll put a link in the description, because I think people will find that useful. I think that's where I'm going to go with my Wood Elves. But yeah, I mean, this fluidity of movement, we've said, adds something to the movement phase, makes movement more flexible, will make combat more interesting, and like you said, bring back little things like those small 5 units, elite units, sort of like in a little buff. And it will do away with, slogging out a combat that you've never got any chance of winning, because your opponent's always going to be steadfast because they've got a million ranks deep. That's cool. It does away with a lot of stuff, but it does mean that, in a rank and file game, it's tough to keep moving all your models around. It's not a skirmish game where you can just kind of shove them on, keeping them in tight order and then changing that order and changing it back. You're right. How many movement trays am I going to need? A few, because probably. I do like the aesthetic of a nice, neat movement tray, and I border my movement trays, and and I would rather.
I was about to bring that up. Sorry, Dan, because we spoke a lot, and a lot of people we've interacted with have said they were hoping it was going to go to that Kings of War style unit, where the unit's just essentially a representative of how many wounds instead of individual models. Whereas this seems to have gone completely on its head, and you're going to need a lot of movement trays. You're going to be touching your models, reorganizing them quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I did say in the previous video that the movement phase always felt to me like the longest phase of the game,
Mm.
and I think it is set to stay that way, isn't it?
I think it's going to be the like quintessential phase of the game. Like if you can win that movement phase, I think everything else will just about fall in line for you.
Yeah. So we're really looking forward to seeing how the movement phase interacts with other phases. We've already seen now that you can do very quick turns and things like that to get your shooting arcs in and get arcs um, for your magic missiles and things like that. It would have been cool if they'd have shown off some of the conveyance spells a bit,
Mm.
because we are going to be able to cast magic in this phase, but it actually doesn't tell you that you're able to cast magic in this phase, or doesn't say when it happens in this order actually, which is quite interesting to me,
That's a
because
very good point.
magic every phase of the game and conveyance spells in the movement phase, and then we have a breakdown of the movement phase and it includes no magic. So yeah, would have liked to have seen that, and when it happens,
I think we'll see that in an article soon. It looks like we're going to do movement magic, shooting, combat. Not movement magic, strategy, movement, shooting, combat. and then we'll start to get in some nitty gritty stuff.
hopefully. But yeah, a bit disappointed we didn't see conveyance spells, because we talked quite a lot in the last video about how we like the idea of chaining magic along the phases, and now we've missed a phase. Oh
Yeah.
well. But we will be back next week if they release an article next week about shooting. So be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that, and we will see you next time. But just before we sign off, don't forget to leave a comment about what you think, because we do love reading the comments, and we read every single comment, and the discussion is always really good and really worthwhile for us, because we just love talking about Warhammer and taking the conversation further. So leave yourself a comment, and we will see you next time.